I looked at my editor as he went over the assignment. "You're going to Cypress Shade to check this thing out, Jessica. I don't give a shit if you believe me or not." He slid a photograph across the table. "I mean, I believe this." I gestured at the picture. In it, a body lay face down, arms and legs spread. The back had been peeled away and the skull was smashed completely. "But you're asking me to write about some National Enquirer bullshit, Frank. Listen, we got you a cabin out there. You can see what's going on. Just write the story, Jess. I know it's bullshit, but just make it good, all right? You got a story about these murders anyway. Swing with that." "No shit, Frank. Thanks." All right, I get it. Here's the key to the place, and here's the address." He handed me a set of keys and a yellow post-it note with the address written on it in red pen. "You know the drill. Go forth. The mass has ended." He made a mock blessing with his hand. I rolled my eyes, took the keys and note, and headed out of the office. "Oh, and Jess, don't let the boogeyman get ya." I could hear the smirk on his face. I got in my car. My bags were already in the back seat. I tossed the keys into the cup holder. Cypress Shade was a few hours away, which gave me time to listen to the audio files Frank had sent me yesterday. I queued them up on my phone and typed the address from the post-it into my GPS before tossing the paper into the cup holder with the keys. I pulled out of the office park and followed the GPS directions to the highway. I put the car in cruise control and thought about the assignment. A series of brutal murders had taken place in Cypress Shade over the past 6 months. Everything indicated a psychotic killer, but the locals told a story of a creature they called the Watcher, something from the town's old folklore. Over the past year, sightings began to be reported. First, the transients that pitched tents in the woods started talking about seeing something among the dense trees, easily dismissed by the upstanding residents of the town. But then the same upstanding citizens began reporting seeing something watching them. That's when the first murder happened. A woman was found walking on the shoulder of the highway covered in blood. She was taken to the hospital where she was interviewed. That interview was on one of the audio recordings I had queued. I pressed play. The recording crackled, and a slight rustling could be heard as if someone was shifting their seat.
"Dr. Reinhold?"
A man's voice came on. There was a silence before a woman's voice was heard.
"It's always watching."
The voice was calm and quiet, but the way the words connected left me uneasy.
"It will never leave."
The woman's voice suddenly became frantic. The sound of a struggle could be heard, and then a terrible high-pitched scream.
"Dr. Reinhold, no."
More sounds of struggle, and then the recording went quiet. The sound of frantic breathing was all that could be heard.
"It's still here."
Dr. Reinhold's voice again returned to its original, unnerving tone. The recording ended, and I stared out the window. The sides of the highway were lined with dense woods, and the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the hot, black asphalt. Dr. Reinhold was a professor of astronomy at Cypress Shade Community College. She was a well-respected member of the community. I knew that from the notes Frank had shared. The police traced the trail of blood she left into the woods and found her husband face down in the rotting leaves. Just like the victim in the photograph, Dr. Reinhold's husband's arms and legs were extended, and his back had been entirely torn off, leaving his internal organs on full display, but intact. His head was utterly crushed, flattened into the ground. I listened to the other 3 recordings of the psychiatrists interviewing, or attempting to interview, Dr. Reinhold as I drove towards Cypress Shade. They were as incoherent and disturbing as the first. Dr. Reinhold was being held at a psychiatric facility. The address was in the notes, and I would visit her when I got to town. I drove the rest of the way in silence, the dark trees funneling me towards Cypress Shade. My stomach growled as I pulled off the exit. I drove down the town's main street and saw a sign for the Starlight Diner. Diners were always a good place for a meal and gossip. I pulled into the uncrowded parking lot and picked a spot near the door. It was a classic-looking building, metal exterior, like an old Airstream trailer with a neon sign glowing bright red. Starlight, the sign read. The A shaped like a child's drawing of a star. I got out of my car and walked to the entrance. I opened the glass door. The bells hanging from the handle rang as I stepped inside. "How are you doing, hon? Just one?" The woman was a middle-aged and kind-looking. She had bad tattoos on each arm, and her black hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail. "Yep, just me tonight. Sit anywhere you'd like." She gestured around the restaurant. I took a seat at the countertop, pulling my chair in and grabbing a plastic menu from the condiment rack in front of me. I looked it over but knew what I wanted. The black-haired woman came over and took a writing pad from the front of her apron. "What'll you have?" "A cheese and tomato omelette and some coffee, please." "No problem." She took the menu from me and called the order out to the cook. He was a young man wearing headphones over a backwards baseball hat. He pulled one side of the headphones from his ear as he listened to the order, and then dropped it back into place, oblivious to what was going on around him. He cracked 2 eggs onto the flat-top grill. "So, what brings you around here?" She didn't explain how she knew I wasn't from there. She didn't have to. "I'm a journalist." This always got people defensive or talking, or both. "You're here about the Watcher, then?" She looked into the coffee as she was pouring. "About the killings, yes. I've been hearing about that thing since I was a little girl, and never took it for anything more than a story. Well, it is just a story." It was bold of me to say, but it was the truth. "I'm Jess, by the way." I extended my hand. "Rosie." She wiped her hand on her apron and shook mine. A man stood up from his booth. He wore a tan trucker's hat and had a thick white beard. He walked to the counter and sat next to me. He didn't turn to look at me. "No, it ain't." He took a cigarette from the pack he had in the front pocket of his denim jacket, put it between his lips, and lit it. I watched as he took a drag and exhaled the smoke from his nose. "Coffee, please," he asked the waitress, before finally turning to face me. "I've seen it." The smoke from his cigarette drifted in the air around his face. The harsh fluorescent lights contrasted the dark bags under his blue eyes. He adjusted his hat and took another drag on his cigarette. "I was at a deer camp. Me and my dad and a few of his friends." The waitress brought his coffee, placing it on the countertop in front of him. "I must have been 11 or 12 at the time. We had a good afternoon hunt that day. I got myself my first buck. I won't forget that." He picked the coffee cup up in the same hand that held his cigarette. "We were sitting around the fire, just shooting the shit like always. I was listening to the adults talk, sipping my soda while they drank beers." He took a sip of coffee, squinting his eyes against the cigarette smoke as he raised the mug. "That thing, it came out of the woods with so much as shifting a leaf. I saw it first." He was looking past me now, his eyes staring into nothing. The cigarette burned in his hand, the coffee mug held still. "It looked right at me. I mean, I froze. I couldn't do nothing while that thing watched me. I remember its face mostly, like a damn wolf gone through a wood chipper. And those eyes, I swear, they were as human as yours or mine." The ash from his cigarette fell on the table. He shook his head and his eyes focused. "My daddy shot it, or shot at it, and it ran back into the woods. He swore it was just a coyote, but I tell you, it was no yote." He finished his coffee and put the cigarette in the glass ashtray that was between us. "Anyway, It ain't no story, ma'am.
He turned to the waitress.
Night, Rosie.
He put his hand to his hat and left the diner, the smoke from his cigarette still rising from the ashtray. I turned off the recorder.
Oh, pay him no mind,
the waitress said. I must have looked concerned. She gathered the coffee mug and ashtray and wiped the counter down with a wet rag.
It's not that, it's just something I heard earlier. Do you know Dr. Reinhold? Oh, of course. She used to put on the planetarium show for the kids. My Jacob loved that.
She trailed off, putting the mug in an industrial sink.
Bless her heart, though. She's down in the psycho hospital now, I guess.
She turned and grabbed my omelette from the counter behind her, putting it in front of me with a mug.
Yeah, the psychiatric hospital.
I took a sip of my coffee.
Why does a town as small as this have its own psych hospital anyways? I guess I never thought about it. It's just always been there. Never seems desperate for patients either.
I finished my omelette and had a few sips of coffee.
Well, I got to get going. Thanks, Rosie. It was good meeting you.
I put cash down on the counter and walked to the door.
Hey, where are you staying, by the way?
I tried to remember what was written on the note Frank had given me.
Palm Cabin, I think. Palmetto Cabin,
she said, her voice lowering.
Yeah, that's the one. That's way out there. Well, just be safe. You never know who's running around those woods. I will. Thanks again, Rosie.
She smiled at me and looked more than a little concerned. I left the diner. The night had gotten darker. The small crescent of the moon did little to light the dark against the lack of streetlights. The pavement was smooth under my feet as I walked, the night silent. I got in my car and took the post-it note from the cup holder and looked down at the address written on it. Palmetto Cabin, 73 Eventide Drive. I entered the address into my phone. I looked up to adjust the mirror, and my heart shuddered as I saw two eyes staring at me. I turned to face the back of the car, my heart racing as I looked out into the night. A raccoon ran behind the diner's dumpster. I shook my head as I turned the car on. I laughed to myself, a small exhale, as I pulled out of the Starlight's parking lot. I drove down Main Street. I passed the drugstore, the hardware store, more than one clothing boutique, an antique store, all the usual for a small town. I didn't expect anyone to be out at this time, but still, the town felt more quiet than it should have been. The air seemed thick, like it was suffocating the town. I drove a while longer, following the GPS out of the town centre and onto the back roads. The darkness was total now. I flipped on my high beams and turned onto Eventide Drive. The lights lit up the dirt road in front of me. The brilliant focus glow made the forest surrounding me feel like a dark wall. I came to the end of the road and pulled into the driveway of Palmetto Cabin. The cabin was dark. My headlights shone on the front porch. It was a cabin like any other. Brown wood siding, a single story with a front porch and a wooden door. I turned my car off but left the lights on so I could see my way. I got out and grabbed my keys from the cup holder and my bags from the back seat. I could hear the crickets go quiet as I walked to the cabin, the gravel under my feet crunching in the silence. I opened the screen and held it behind my back while I unlocked the door. It took some maneuvering, but the bolt opened with a heavy thud. I opened the door and made my way inside. The screen door slammed behind me. The car's headlights added a faint glow to the inside of the dark cabin. I palmed the walls next to each side of the door until I found a switch. I flicked it on, and the cabin lights blinked to life. They were bright, but warm and pleasant. The cabin was tidy and furnished in the stereotypical way. I didn't look around. I headed back to the car. I stepped off the porch and looked down the driveway. The headlights shone in my eyes, and it was difficult to see anything outside their glare. But through the light, I saw a shadow. I stopped. The hair on my neck rose. I took a breath, remembering the raccoon. The shadow shifted in the dark, its bulk much larger than any raccoon. "Hey!" I called toward it, clapping my hands. I backed up toward the cabin slowly, clapping again. "Hey, bear!" It must be a black bear, I told myself. They were common enough around here. I continued to clap and shout. I saw the shadow move toward the trees until it was impossible to make out anything. I turned my phone's flashlight on. It was no use in the light of my car, but I would need it in the dark. I walked steadily, alert but tamping down my fear. I opened the car door, reached in, turned the lights off, and closed the door. The flashlight guided me back to the cabin. The sound of my feet on the gravel again was the only sound in the dark night. Back inside, I noticed the smell. Not unpleasant, but distinct. Old furniture and old walls mixed with the smell of settled smoke from the well-used fireplace. The cabin was only one room, and I placed my bag near the bed. A large sofa faced the fireplace, and a dining room table sat between the bed and a small kitchen. I took my laptop from one of my bags, placed it on the table, and walked to the kitchen cabinets, opening them until I found the glasses. I filled one at the sink and took it with me as I sat in front of my computer. I powered on my laptop and opened the folder containing the files Frank had collected for me. I opened the file labeled Folklore and took a sip from the glass. The forest had come alive again now that I was no longer intruding. The crickets and the frogs were loud, but their songs were beautiful. They reminded me of time spent in the forest with my father. I read through the file. Most legends like this can be traced at least partially back to pre-colonial times. The stories evolving and taking on new aspects from the introduction of Europeans, but still having their roots in ancient legends. The Watcher did not have this history. The earliest appearance of anything resembling the Watcher were from court records dating to 1870, when a man named Reinhold Fitzgeoffrey was put to death for the murder of 3 men. All 3 bodies were found in the same state as the victims of the recent killings. Reinhold was recorded as being incoherent during the trial. The only time he spoke in court, he said, "It was watching me." He attempted to kill himself by bashing his head against the walls of his cell the night before his execution. His final words as he fell at the gallows were, "It's here." There were no more related killings after that, not until the recent murders, but it was enough to plant the seed of legend. The tales of the beast that would freeze a person with its terrible gaze grew over time, the legends embedding themselves into local folklore. So why now? Why would a copycat killer suddenly start acting out the grotesque murders from the town's history? I thought about this as I sat back in my chair, sipped water from the glass, and listened to the sounds of the forest. I opened the file containing the pictures of the recent victims and looked at each of them. They were almost identical. Where the backs had been peeled off, it was clearly apparent that the flesh from between the bones had also been removed, leaving the organs intact behind a cage of bone. I closed the laptop and finished my water, leaving the glass on the table. I turned out the light, changed into my nightclothes, and got into bed. The sheets smelled old but clean. I closed my eyes and fell asleep to the sound of crickets in the dark. I woke to the sound of glass breaking. My eyes adjusted to the dark. The moonlight came through the windows, cast a faint glow through the cabin. I looked toward the sound. My glass had fallen off the table. I was about to go back to sleep when something shivered in the corner of my eye. I turned my head, and next to my bed, a shapeless form stood. Shadows dripped from where its edges seemed to be before warping again into shapeless darkness. 2 green dots glowed from the center of this void. my own eyes unable to look away. I sat up in bed screaming, the nightmare still vivid in my mind. It was already fading when I caught my breath, inhaling deeply as I looked around the cabin. The crickets still chirped. The glass still sat on the table, the dawn light reflecting off the condensation that coated it. I padded around the bed for my phone and looked at the time. 5:30 a.m. I wasn't going to fall back asleep now. I got up and sat on the edge of the bed, looking at the dust floating in the sunlight. The crickets began to quiet, their nightly rituals ending. The drive to the hospital was pleasant. The fall air felt cool after the summer's heat. The hospital itself was unassuming, a brick building with a modest parking lot. I walked in and went to the front desk.
How can I help you?
A nurse sat behind a computer. Her black scrubs were neatly pressed, and the badge clipped to her chest was tidy.
Hi, I'm from the Weekly Daily. Ah, you must be Jessica.
She looked down at a note on her desk before she said my name.
Frank called before to say to expect you.
I wasn't sure why Frank had any influence here, but I didn't care.
Can I grab some ID to check you in?
I handed her my driver's license, and she clicked the mouse and typed on the computer's old keyboard. She handed the ID back.
Just have a seat over there, and Dr. Fleming will be with you shortly.
She held her hand out toward a row of seats against the wall behind me.
Thanks.
I sat in one of the chairs. The hospital was clean as expected. The lobby was relatively small. The set of 8 or 9 chairs made up the waiting area. Large double doors led out of the lobby. I was shuffling the pile of magazines on the table in front of me when the door swung open. A young doctor walked towards me. He wore green scrubs and a white lab coat. His conservative brown hair was parted to the side, and a grey stethoscope hung around his neck.
Jessica. Yeah, you must be Dr. Fleming. That's me.
He reached out his hand. I shook it.
I hear you're writing an article on the recent murders. I am. I was hoping to talk with Dr. Reinhold. Well, we can see her, but I'm not sure how much talking we'll be doing. Yeah, I listened to the recordings.
We walked towards the double doors.
Pretty fucked up. Tell me about it.
He held his badge to the reader on the wall next to the doors. It beeped, and he walked through. He held the door for me, and we stepped into a long hallway. The line of harsh lights overhead stretched into the distance. A large orderly stood to the side. His head was shaved, and he nodded as we passed by. Dr. Fleming nodded back, pursing his lips into a casual smile.
She's just down here.
We walked down the hall past repeating, identical doors. We came to a room numbered 33. Dr. Fleming reached into the pocket of his lab coat and pulled out a ring with dozens of keys. He fingered through them until arriving on one he was looking for and used it to unlock the door. I half expected to walk into a padded room, but it was a small, fine space. A bed was against one wall, while a desk and tool cabinet sat on the opposite wall. Dr. Reinhold sat in a chair facing a window that looked out onto a small garden.
Hey, Sarah. You have a visitor.
Dr. Fleming's voice was gentle. Sarah's head shifted slightly, but she did not turn and did not speak. I pulled the chair from under the desk and sat next to her. She smelled faintly of cheap shampoo. She wore her blonde hair down, and it rested behind her shoulders. Her head turned slightly toward me. I saw her eyebrows furrow in thought. Then she turned her face toward me. Her green eyes stared directly at mine. They grew wide, as if she recognized something. Slowly her mouth opened, and she raised her hand towards me, pointing a finger. I could see the dirt underneath her fingernail. Dr. Fleming was about to move towards me, but I held my hand out to steady him.
You are being watched,
she whispered at me. I showed no reaction, but goosebumps rose on my arms. Her eyes grew wider, and her mouth gaped open. Grotesque lines of saliva webbed her lips. Suddenly, she rose from her chair. I too rose up, and as I backed away, she flung herself into the corner of the room. Her eyes never left me. The terrible finger never stopped pointing. She withdrew her hand and placed both over her eyes. Blood began to drip from her forehead where her jagged nails bit into her skin.
Me! It's still watching me!
She was screaming now, the blood dripping down her hands and onto the floor.
John!
Dr. Fleming yelled out the door, and footsteps rang down the hallway. I stared in horror as the blood kept flowing. Dr. Fleming tried to pry Sarah's hands from her face. The orderly came into the room then and helped wrestle her hands away from her bleeding head. The orderly restrained her while Dr. Fleming stuck a syringe into her neck, holding her steady as she slowly fell unconscious. I stood watching as nurses were called in. The sounds muffled as I tried to stay focused, my mind a fog. What was that? What did she mean? I saw the nurses take Sarah out of the room on a stretcher, bandages over her face. I stared at the puddle of blood. I could hear voices and nurses speaking. Still, I stared at that red pool. Jess? Was someone saying my name?
Jessica!
Dr. Fleming's voice snapped me out of my shock.
Are you okay?
Yeah, I am, I said, but I wasn't sure.
She hasn't spoken in weeks. I don't know what the hell that was.
We walked out of the room and down the long hallway. I heard the hum from the lights then. The harsh glow hurt my eyes. I didn't say anything. We walked through the lobby and out to my car.
Are you sure you're okay?
Yeah, I'm all right. I opened my car's door.
I'm sorry about that. I should have been more careful.
He ran his hand through his hair.
Hey, listen. If you do need to talk, here's my card. Thanks, Doc.
I took the card and put it in my pocket. My head hurt, and I couldn't say more. I got in the car and backed out of the parking space. Dr. Fleming watched as I pulled onto the road. I arrived at the cabin and sat on the sofa. I stared into the dead fireplace and tried to get Dr. Reinhold's green eyes out of my mind. The sun was bright. It shined through the windows and warmed the cabin. I closed my eyes and leaned my head back. I heard a woodpecker drumming in the distance, the dull rhythm echoing in the woods. A breeze hit my face and I opened my eyes. Had I left the door open? I looked at the door. It was closed. Then I saw it. The shadow. It came through the closed door. It darkened the room where it moved. My eyes grew wide as I stared at it. My breath became shallow and rapid. The shadow moved towards me, and what fleeting form I saw chilled my blood. I saw a face, I thought. It was gone before I was sure. Again, the face warped into reality. I noticed the green eyes then, floating in the shadow as it moved towards me. They froze me. They watched me as I hyperventilated on the sofa. I saw 4 terrible hands now, padding across the floor. Toes human-like at one moment, but indistinguishable masses of black shadow the next.
Wake up,
I told myself as I clenched my eyes shut.
Wake up.
I opened my eyes and the beast was standing in front of me, its eyes watching me. The sun still shone bright, but where the thing stood, no light touched. I could feel my palms begin to wet, my fingernails cutting into my flesh as I clenched my fists. The thing tilted its head now, the shadow moving like smoke as it leaned closer to my face. I turned my head but could not keep my eyes off the beast. I could see my breath then. The air chilled as the thing snorted the shadow. I could not focus on any one part of it. Its form seemed to come and go from my own reality, its green eyes mere inches from my face. I could smell the scent of burning flowers as it watched me. It blinked its terrible eyes, and I felt a violent jolt in my body. Still frozen, I clenched my teeth, saliva spit from my lips as my breath came fast. Then, the shadow left. First slowly, still watching me as it moved away, and then it shuddered, blinking through reality as it disappeared beyond the door. Again, I felt that terrible wind on my face. I tried to calm myself, but my vision began to close as I continued to hyperventilate. I remembered the pool of red blood in Sarah's room before I passed out. It was dark when I woke up. I had a terrible headache and my hands felt numb. I looked down at them and saw they were covered in congealed blood. I remembered the green eyes, the terrible cold that followed the fear as it overtook me. But these feelings, these memories, did not fade like so many dreams I had before. I went to the bathroom to wash my hands. I looked at my reflection in the mirror. Dark circles surrounded my eyes. I realized then how exhausted I was. I rinsed my hands and watched the blood flow into the sink. The wounds were deep and I had no bandages. I grabbed 2 washcloths from the towel rack and held one in each, squeezing tightly. I was too tired to do more. I went to the bed and fell asleep with my clothes on. I slept soundly, dreaming of nothing. Didn't bother to change my clothes when I woke up. I slept late and was groggy when I got out of bed. The washclothes were stuck to my hands with dried blood. I opened my fingers and could feel the wounds in my palms stretching, threatening to tear apart. I winced and stopped. I walked to the car. Each step felt heavy. The doors, both the cabin and the car, were an effort to open with the state of my hands. Fishing the key out of my pocket was particularly difficult, but I managed to get them into my fingers and start the car. I drove to the hospital then, my hands in fists, resting on the sides of the steering wheel. I turned the car off when I parked, but left the key in the ignition. I walked into the hospital and to the front desk. The nurse looked up, and for a moment I saw the shock on her face. She composed herself.
Jessica, are you all right? I need to see Dr. Fleming. Okay, I mean, of course.
She picked up a phone from the desk in front of her and dialed a number.
Hi, Dr. Fleming. Jessica is here and says she needs to see you. Yes, from the other day. It doesn't look like it. Yes, I think that would be best.
She hung up the phone.
He's on his way now. Thanks.
I went to sit in the familiar chairs. The double door swung open and Dr. Fleming walked into the lobby. When he saw me, he rushed over, knelt in front of me, and took my hands in his. He looked at them, the white rags now stained red.
Jessica, what happened? I don't know,
I said, my mind still numb.
That's all right. We'll get you fixed up.
We walked through the doors and into the long hallway. The humming lights now seemed louder than before. We walked down the hall and into Dr. Fleming's office. Sit, please. He pulled a leather armchair away from the wall. I sat.
Wait here. I'll be right back. I promise.
I nodded at him and he left the room. I looked around. The office was furnished with a wooden desk, 2 leather chairs, and dark bookshelves lined with medical volumes. I looked down at my hands. I could remember the eyes staring at me, the terrible formless face watching me. It had to have been a nightmare, my research getting to me. Dr. Fleming came back into the room carrying a pile of medical supplies. He pulled the other chair near me and sat, placing the supplies on the desk beside us, and leaned toward me. He took one of my hands into his.
This is only water.
He grabbed a plastic bottle. He squeezed the water onto the red towel, and I could feel the warm liquid soaking through. He steadily added more while gently pulling at the towel. Eventually, the blood gave up its grip, and the towel was pulled away painlessly.
I saw it last night,
I said to him, as he repeated the procedure on the other hand.
What do you mean? What did you see?
I thought I heard a drop of anxiety in his voice.
The Watcher.
The words left my mouth before I could think about them. Dr. Fleming returned the bottle to the desk.
Like in a dream.
He inspected the now visible wounds on my hands.
These are going to need stitches. No, I mean, I don't know. It was a dream, Jessica.
His voice was clearly agitated now. He took another bottle from the desk.
This is going to hurt,
he warned me, before he sprayed alcohol onto my cuts. I winced. The alcohol stung, but it didn't last.
It didn't feel like one. It still doesn't. Why do I remember it so vividly? You've been knee-deep in this thing for days now. Things like this have a way of getting into your head.
He took a suture kit off the desk. He removed a filled syringe and held it above my palm.
On 3. 1, 2, 3.
He injected me with anesthetic. It didn't hurt.
I remember the smell. I can still smell it now. Sensory hallucinations are common in these cases.
His voice grew quicker as he began stitching my wounds.
I think I saw something, Doctor.
He stitched for a few more moments, saying nothing.
It was not real.
He slammed his fist against the desk. A shock of adrenaline hit my system as I saw the look on his face. I stood from the chair, pulling my hand from his. The stitches were half finished in my left hand, and the needle hung from the end of the thread. I backed toward the door, staring at Dr. Fleming as the anger fell from his face.
Jessica, I
turned and ran out of the office. He followed me into the hall, reaching out and grabbing my arm. I pulled free. The needle that hung from my hand caught on his lab coat, tearing the half-finished stitches out of my numb hand. I ran down the hall and could hear his footsteps behind me. I made it to the double doors and burst through. He followed me into the lobby as I raced towards the exit.
You can't leave it behind, Jessica.
I heard Dr. Fleming yell after me as I ran to my car.
It will follow you.
I watched my numb hand reach toward the car's door. It bounced off. I slapped the dead hand against the door again, and the fingers hooked around the silver handle. I pulled and the door opened. I sat and forced my fingers around the key I had left in the ignition. The car started, and I drove away from the hospital, my tires squealing. I sped to the cabin, my mind racing. He knew. What did he know? The adrenaline was still burning my veins as I pulled up to the cabin. The anesthesia had begun to wear off as I tore the cabin door open and threw my computer and clothes into my bags. I ran out the door and back into my car. I left Cypress shade behind me as I pulled onto the highway. Finally, I took a moment to breathe.
What the fuck?
I shouted, slamming my half-numb hands against the steering wheel. I stared at the white lines of the highway as I drove home.
This ain't bad, Jess.
Frank read over the article. In it, I made no mention of what happened. I wrote about the murders, about the history, and about the town. Straightforward.
Yeah, thanks, Frank. What are you doing tonight? You look like you could use a drink. We're heading to the dockside. You should come.
He looked genuinely worried about me.
Not tonight. I need to get some rest and put my feet up for a few days. All right, well, if you change your mind, you know where to find us. See you later, Frank. Adios.
He lifted his hand in a half-serious salute. I made it back to my house before dark. I got in the shower and let the hot water pour over my head. I turned the heat higher, and steam filled the bathroom. The water stung as it hit my skin, but it cleaned me deeply. I washed and left the shower, putting my bathrobe on and heading to the kitchen. I sat at the table and looked at the salt and pepper shaker set in front of me. Their coloring was beautiful, striking green like two eyes staring back at me. Remembered when the Watcher came. I knew I should have been terrified of the memory, but while I looked at those false green eyes, a sense of longing overcame me. That's when I smelled the scent of burning flowers. My stomach fluttered as the scent hit me. I felt a chill fill the air, and I smiled. I stood, turning around, and saw the shadow before me. I was not afraid as it moved towards me. I saw then that in its unknowable jaws it held a body. Blood dripped from the corpse as the shadow brought it towards me. The green eyes watched me again now, piercing me as they had before. But now I understood. The shadow dropped the body at my feet. I saw then that it was not a corpse, but a living man. The man struggled, but the shadow held him down with one of its hands, a perversion of a human's limb. I looked down at the man and watched his face as he struggled. He turned his head towards me.
Jessica, what?
Before Frank could finish, another limb emerged from the shadow and crushed his skull against the linoleum floor. I watched this with a sense of calm, a complete understanding. My mind was at peace as the shadow tore at the corpse at my feet, tendrils emerging from the black void to tear flesh from bone. The carnage ended, and the now flayed corpse lay still. The shadow watched me again now. Its green eyes shifted from me to the corpse and back. It moved closer now. It bent its now visible head down and nudged the corpse toward me with its shifting face. I smiled at the watcher, tears filling my eyes as I reached down and plucked the liver from behind the ribs of Frank's corpse. I bit into the warm organ, blood and tears streaming down my cheeks. I reached out to caress the shadow's face, but I could no longer find it in the shifting form before me. The watcher's beautiful green eyes stared into my own. I wept as the shadow fell over me. Thanks for watching. If you enjoy these stories, be sure to click subscribe and check out some more stories here.